Hello, welcome to my presentation for my final project, which was researching the research paper on GIS-based niche modeling for mapping species habitat. So I chose this research paper because it discusses the use of GIS for habitat assessment and niche modeling, and I hope to become a wildlife biologist in the future, so this paper will provide some insight into how GIS can be applied to my future career. This paper discusses a niche modeling approach used to find the minimum habitat requirements for a species. This is a really important and useful tool for habitat assessment and management for a particular species. And with GIS, this modeling approach can help assess an area for potential habitat, comparing resources within the area to determine the optimum habitat for the species. From this information, researchers can then designate the best study areas to confirm potential habitat for the target species. This is especially important for my future field, as I am definitely sure that I will need to do habitat assessment and niche modeling in the future. And this map is simply an example of how GIS is used within this paper. This is the Habitat Similarity Index for a niche model, and it is a full-rank ecological niche model for California gnatcatchers based on 21 environmental variables. And habitat similarity to known occupied locations increases as the color darkens. And we will talk more about this map in a little bit, but again, it's just an example of how GIS is used within this paper. So the purpose of the project is to understand niche modeling and how it can be useful when determining habitat suitability. Other focuses of the project include understanding past habitat suitability models and their pitfalls, along with understanding this new niche model methods and its pitfalls. The mathematics and statistics of niche modeling will also be discussed, as well as using examples to view niche modeling in real field studies. Finally, this project will discuss how niche modeling can be applied to current and future studies surrounding conservation and research of species and their habitat. So the underlying problem is that in the past, niche modeling was developed to help analyze multiple factors within a habitat all at once, rather than just one at a time. In the past, ecological modelers have faced challenges such as these when creating accurate habitat suitability models. So niche modeling aims to alleviate these challenges and create more habitat suitability models, or create accurate habitat suitability models. So some of the geospatial questions to be answered are how has GIS been used in the past for habitat suitability models? How can GIS environmental data be used with niche modeling? And how can niche modeling be used to visualize GIS? And how can GIS and niche modeling be used in the future? So this report aims to create a geospatial model for habitat suitability and species environmental niche. The niche model is created using analysis and calculations with a series of formulas using various population and environmental variables. And these are simply some of the niche model calculations that they were using in the paper, the main equations. But these calculations have three assumptions. The first is that the selection response by the species towards the habitat has been fully characterized. The sample area contains the full range of habitat variation to which the species responds, and the appropriate variables have been identified and measured with no unimportant variables left out unimportant variables included or important variables left out. So this basically means that all of the important habitat elements are being considered, as well as making sure that the species actually interacts with all of these elements. And this first equation is the full rank niche model. So this equation is a standardized difference between the values of a set of environmental variables for any point and the mean values for those same variables calculated from all points at which the species was detected. So the first half of that equation, the y minus mu, is those first value, the values of the environmental variables, and the second is the mean values for those variables. And there's also other ways that the paper explains about how they got to this equation, as well as other equations that they use like within this one and stuff like that, for actually calculating the niche model, but I just included the most important and basic equations, just so it wasn't too math heavy and difficult to understand. So this is the reduced rank niche model equation. So identifying a minimum set of basic habitat requirements for a species and using only those variables within the equation is known as partitioning. So this is also known as the partitioned niche model equation. And this helps create a more broad niche model containing the most important environmental variables. So as I'll get into in a little bit, we can really use only the most important environmental variables for the species to be able to create a more broad niche model, which will indicate larger areas for habitat suitability, rather than the full rank niche model, which has a little bit more specified environmental variables just because it includes so many, rather than this one, which is a lot more broad. So it's kind of a little bit counterintuitive, but that's the way that works. So putting the niche models to work. So the researchers assessed habitat in a little bit less than 500,000 acres or hectares of western Riverside County in California for the California gnatcatcher in order to test these niche model equations. So they looked at 21 environmental variables at 566 points that were randomly selected from 706 locations that the gnatcatchers had been detected. So they used raster data that was collected along with habitat assessment in the field, as well as observations of gnatcatchers in each location, and they used pixels to quantify the environmental variables that were assessed. Researchers then used the niche model equations to create maps containing habitat similarity indices for the California gnatcatcher. So rather than using an area that they weren't sure if the species was actually seen in that area or not, they used a species, the California gnatcatcher, that they knew was in these areas. That way they could really be able to test really easily whether or not this habitat suitability model actually would work, or this niche model would actually work, and then they can go from there. So this table is really important for those niche models, and it shows each of the 21 environmental variables assessed within the California gnatcatcher habitat. So larger absolute eigenvector values are considered more important for the habitat of the species, while smaller values mean the variable can vary considerably with little change to habitat use. So in the actual table, all the way to the left is those environmental variables, and those are simply the codes that the researchers used to determine which variable was which. In the middle, we have the actual description, which is what they would have actually assessed inside the habitat to determine its actual numbers and everything like that and values. And then the eigenvector value is all the way to the right. That one determines how quote-unquote important the variable is for the species. And this first map that they use depicts the full rank ecological niche model of the gnatcatchers using the unpartitioned niche equation based on all 21 environmental variables. So all of those variables in the previous table were used for this equation, which again, it's a little bit more specific because it includes all of those variables rather than just the few that are the most important. So this habitat similarity index is represented by varying colors, with the darkest color representing occupied locations and those best suited for gnatcatcher habitat. So within the map on the right-hand side, you'll see that habitat similarity index for that legend. And as I mentioned, the darker colors mean that habitat is more suitable. So you can tell that it's kind of like all throughout the county, and it's not very broad. It's more specific. It has a little bit less of colors than you'll see in the next map. But again, it uses all of those 21 environmental variables, so it's going to be a little bit more specific. And this map, as you can see right away, it depicts a lot more habitat for the gnatcatcher because it uses the reduced rank ecological niche model for the gnatcatchers using the partitioned equation. So this model uses the 3 environmental variables that were determined the most important for the gnatcatcher habitat. The model was then created using those 3 variables. So as I mentioned, this is more specific because it does carry or determine it has been determined based on only those variables that were determined to be most important based on those eigenvector values. So this map again has the same layout as the previous one, so the legend is in the right hand, and again those darker colors represent more best habitat for the gnatcatchers. So as you can tell, this one has a lot more habitat that they have identified for the gnatcatchers. So the analysis and results. So for the actual analysis, the researchers didn't really explicitly say which GIS application they used to create their maps, but they did mention the use of SAS, for the statistics and analysis of the niche model. And SAS is an analytics software and solutions company which offers a variety of software for specific analyses. So they didn't really say exactly which GIS application they used, they just said that they used GIS. But the conclusion that they came to was that they determined that ecological niche modeling, as we have kind of seen throughout this whole project, is a really powerful tool to assess species distribution patterns and determine habitat suitability. So this new technique allows biologists to compare among species which habitat elements drive habitat selection, as well as which of those elements are the best predictor for species distribution. Biologists can also assess how other species share uncommon or common responses to habitat elements, thus impacting each species distribution. So along with just determining one species distribution, they can also determine other species distributions to look at such things as like predator-prey relationships, and where population distribution is with those, and as we'll talk to in a little bit, they can also look at natural and anthropogenic changes. So 2 important benefits to understanding habitat relationships. The first, as I just mentioned, allows researchers to refine future monitoring and sample techniques. So this will further allow tests on habitat relationships and studies determining how populations respond to both natural and anthropogenic changes to environmental conditions. So in the future, things can always be refined and be made better, and I'm sure that this will happen with niche modeling. And we can also look at things like anthropogenic and natural changes to the environment to determine how that species distribution will change. So for example, we can look at things like migration and natural changes to the habitat to determine like if a storm rolls through and it damages some of the habitat and it damages some of those important variables for the habitat, how that will change species distribution. And then we can also look at anthropogenic changes, so how humans will influence species distribution based on the changes that they make to their habitat. So for example, if a new neighborhood was built somewhere and it kind of shifts that distribution or anything like that, we will be able to see that, as well as any effects that climate change have to the area. And the second important benefit is that it allows researchers to determine locations with a high need for conservation in respect to a target species. So this area can then be prioritized for acquisition and integration into a reserve network. So say, for example, our California gnatcatchers are determined to be an endangered or a threatened species. We can go through the kind of more politics side and determine, okay, which habitat is the best suited for gnatcatchers, and we can kind of prioritize that area for preservation and conservation and getting that area into a reserve network rather than other areas that aren't quite so good for habitat suitability. So we can kind of do it that way. And so the project was a success by these considerations, but it can always be refined and improved upon in the future, as I mentioned. The ecological niche model created is successful when it correctly identifies suitable habitat for the target species, which can be done by assessing the habitat using more conventional in-person methods. And one of the really important things that these niche models have provided for wildlife biologists and wildlife managers is that they can determine what habitat is best for a species without actually going into the field yet. And they can really pinpoint areas that are going to be the most suitable for the species and determine, okay, where are we going to see the species, where are we more likely or less likely to see the species, and then they can actually go out into the field and really do those as in-person conventional assessments and everything to make sure that that species is actually there and that that habitat is actually suitable for the species.